Chapter 2 for Exodus The Archimedes Engine was huge and had a lot of really interesting developments and gave us an explanation as to how Finn got into the situation we were introduced to him with in Chapter 1. For anyone new to this series, this will contain spoilers for Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 for Exodus The Archimedes Engine, and I would advise you start with my breakdown and thoughts of the Chapter 1 video. Now, with that out of the way, let's jump right into Chapter 2 as there is a ton to get through. I'll be going through most of the major events throughout the chapter in order and giving my thoughts as we move through the events in the chapter. Now, I forget their particular name, but from my notes, we start off following one of the Empresses and they're getting ready for the coming major meeting between all of the Empresses and the next cycled Celestial Empress in line for becoming queen for her enthronement ceremony. While things are getting set in motion and they're getting ready to depart, I thought it was really interesting when we got the definition of the orbital towers. They described them as a giant tower that reached out to a georing around the planet, which was essentially carbon steel wrapped around the planet. It apparently provided stability for some of the towers by having habitats, commercial ports for imports and exports out of the planet, industrial stations, and defense systems for the planet as well, essentially acting as a massive dock which housed important systems for the planet, which gave the planet celestial-made rings of carbon fiber. Apparently, citizens of the planet could see the georing from anywhere on the planet's surface, in particular here on Kelowon, which was the name of the planet, and also the capital city name for the planet as well. Which for Celestials, they mentioned they always had the capital cities on the equator of the planet they were on. After that, we got our first mentions of Zuberi, which is a Celestial I've heard about even before reading the book, who is probably going to be very important to the events that happen in this story, and in my opinion, might even be a Celestial who in one way or another might be referenced in the video game as well. They mentioned that Zuberi is supposed to be one of the Empresses who was queen and wanted to be the forever queen, essentially betraying every other Empress. In turn, she unified all of the other Empresses against her, and then they ended up killing her, which we will later see happened in a very sadistic and brutal fashion. They then split the power among all the other Empresses equally again after they took this Empress down. We also get a mention that this current Empress that we are following chooses certain memories every time to take with her into her next host so she can remember important things. Which is important for two reasons. One, because we know that the Crown Dominion Celestials not only are able to essentially live forever through mind lines, but we now know they can choose what memories they take every time. But also, two, they are limited to 200 to 300 years worth of memories when transferring over to their next host. Sure, this is of course a lot by our standards, but essentially this means they have to whittle their memories down to the most important details from life to life, and 200 to 300 years from the knowledge we have of their lifespans from their tease in Chapter 1 is less than even one lifetime worth of memories. The Empress we are following then mentions that she always retains the memories of the beginning of the Accord, which happened after the Zuberi takedown, and what she knows about every other Empress, because she doesn't really trust any of them. After this information, they start setting off to the ceremony and meeting event. In this section, we learn that the Empress has multiple princesses of her own for potential Mindline hosts in the future. They all seemingly had different hair and skin colors and were between the ages of 11 and 15. They all also carried the traditional bloodstone buds on them as well. Some of the important things she mentions on the journey is that tradition is the absolute driving force of the Crown Dominion because they see tradition as stability, and stability in their eyes is the way to get to success and triumph. She also mentions that if anything was ever a threat or challenges the Dominion as a whole, this would in turn unite all under the Accord against that threat in question. On the way to the meeting, we also see something that might be common in the video game, in that she mentions some of the escort for her and the other Empresses that are en route have guards wearing breastplates with their family colors and emblems and sigils. Which reminded me of the armor that June and Orion have been seen wearing in their respective shots in their respective trailers, with the black and gold armor with the Aslan family emblem being the lion with the wings, meaning this might be a common thing not only for Celestials, but Traveler dynasties, and could be something we see a lot of in the game. While staying en route to the meeting, we see elephants pulling one of the Celestial Empress's carriages, and the communique from Mikhail Yalbo, the Archon that we followed in the first chapter, comes into the Empress, basically relaying all of the information we got from the Heresy Archon in Chapter 1. They said the communication came in as soon as he came through the nearest gate of heaven, implying that communication at extra long range, or at the very least at ranges past the gates of heaven, that communication of this length is not possible in the Exodus universe. At least not to messages that can be encrypted, since they did make a point of saying the message was in fact encrypted. Here, the Empress and her data master mentioned that planetary movements haven't been recorded as happening since the Remnant era, and built upon what they heard initially between Makayo and the Heresy Archon about the Gamatu trying to build the Dyson Sphere, they teased this could be the reason the planet is actually moving towards them. Really quickly, if you're like me and don't know what a Dyson Sphere is, I looked it up, and apparently a Dyson Sphere is a structure that is trying to harness the energy that a live star gives off. And it's assumed that this captured energy would be able to power massive amounts of technology or next generation types of civilizations off of the energy provided. They mention that maybe the Elohim themselves are involved in the movement of the planet Dolad, the gas giant that was mentioned in Chapter 1. If you don't know, just from what we know off the game's official website and from the book so far, the Elohim are essentially the biggest deal in the Centauri Cluster. They said that they probably did this in order to help the Gamatu in building the Dyson Sphere, since they would probably think it's a worthwhile future or endeavor. But it's still unclear as to why things are playing out as they have so far, especially when it comes to Dolad's movement. They also mentioned maybe someone other than the Elohim could be involved in the planet's movement, but they would need to know how the Archimedes engines operate, and so they suspect other Celestials, in particular a race known as the Talak-Te. After that, they bring up the Maruyama, one of my personal favorite Celestials that I want to know everything about, which I got personally interested from the trailer teasing them for the game. They mentioned that a major grouping of Maruyama are very close to the Crown Dominion. I believe they said something like 5 light years away. Then we finally move on to following Finn. Here we learn that Finn was a part of some sort of noble family, and he hated it with a passion. He rebelled against it since he was a youth, and alluded that a pure human bloodline is looked at lower than a Uranic. This was implied by Finn mentioning his dating life and talking to a girl who was all human, saying that his family would disapprove of her because of it, and the fact that she also wasn't from a family with money. His goal ultimately seems to be to travel the stars as a traveler, but in order to be accepted as a part of a traveler crew, you apparently have to have a really good reputation, which you have to prove by going on a bunch of mercenary odd jobs to prove your worth. You have to prove that you can be reliable and helpful. This has me questioning if this will be something June has to do in some of his early missions, or if he immediately has credibility because of his father and his dynasty. Finn, after leaving his noble household, went on to getting his own place and getting a job at a club so he could keep an ear out for any odd jobs that people were recruiting for. Eventually, he heard of a job requiring network expertise that he thought he could handle. And since he was a Uranic who could interface with networks, he thought it was the perfect job. He thought the networking would be easy, but he wasn't too sure since he hadn't done something like this before. So he ended up lying about being familiar with this work in order to get on board. This job was then known as the Ozan job. Finn eventually met with the other members of his 4-man team, where they were given a briefing on the mission by their leader. This in particular heavily reminded me of the scene in the gameplay trailer between Tom, Elise, and June, where they seem to be getting familiar and probably talking shop at the closed down bar, discussing their potential mission that they probably got together for. I would assume from the Elise and June introduction that happened earlier in the gameplay trailer right before that scene, that this might be their first mission together that they maybe even randomly put feelers out for, and after meeting for the first time, decided to do whatever the mission is together after all. Getting back to the mission with Finn though, Finn's first mission was to make these Ozan trucks unusable, but make it look like they weren't sabotaged at all, so that a rival company which hired them to do this could take their contracts of hauling mined ore to the orbital towers of the planet that they were on. While following Finn on this mission, he was doing his part when he was attacked by an awakened dog that leapt at him. He used something called a nerve gun and fired it at the dog's hind legs. After it was immobilized, he touched its neuropad and told it to freeze through the connection. This is the first display that we've actually seen where a Uranic or someone with this ability has controlled an awakened animal. Apparently the dog was fighting off his command, but because of Finn's controlling of horses back on his rich family's estate, he was able to dominate the dog in a sense and overwhelm the dog's thoughts anyways. Apparently, this awakened dog had orders instilled in it from its owners, telling it to attack anyone in the compound, to which Finn was overriding it by telling it he would give it treats if it didn't and calm down. During all of this, Finn said that he had to keep his hand on the awakened dog's neural pad because if not, his previously programmed command would take effect again, which might be something important to keep in mind for the Exodus video game, and will for sure be something worth keeping in mind for the tabletop RPG if you hold any personal sessions for it. And is something you'll definitely want to keep in the back of your mind during the official Star Heist campaign, which is a campaign that they're officially running on Archetype Entertainment's YouTube channel for the tabletop RPG with James Olin as the Dungeon Master. Getting back to Finn's story though, finally he used a tranquilizer of sorts on the awakened dog and finished out his mission after feeling really successful with his actions. After the job, the company 10 days later went bankrupt, and Finn in turn was trusted with more and more odd job offers as his rep was starting to build. Then, for me personally, we got something I wasn't expecting at this section of the story, a time skip. This time skip apparently was 2 years long. In it we come back and he has way more jobs under his belt. He's not famous or anything, but he's getting more and more offers as his reputation rises. Notably, the boss from his first job at the Ozan job, Urana, comes to him with promises of a golden opportunity, which as I was reading, already set off massive red flags in my head. During their conversation, they did mention something super interesting though. They said that Urinic's neural interfaces allowed for faster response times when connecting to weapons, which led to advantages in combat situations. Which sounds like something to keep in mind for the game, and of course the tabletop RPG, as mentioned previously. Getting back to the job at hand, essentially, Urana wanted Finn's help with stopping a major influential family from stopping a voting procedure from passing in the Senate. But a person dropped out and he wanted Finn to fill in. Urana also said they themselves were also dropping out, but because they had an opportunity to go on an exodus with their cousin's dynasty, where Urana would be gone for 14 to 19 years, give or take. After Finn eventually caves and accepts the job offer, he learns the mission is to take down a family called the Kinatai family, headquartered in downtown of the city, 50 stories high in a skyscraper. In order for the mission to go smoothly and by the book, they have to kill the family and destroy their businesses like refineries and warehouses. Finn then eventually meets with a major operative of the mission named Liliana. Liliana and him are at the bar and they have a back and forth. Namely, he mentions about wanting to go to Lydon, and she mentions she's actually from there, saying that it's actually a shithole. For those of you that might not remember, Lydon is the major planet in the video game and where your homeworld is for June. So them referring to it as a shithole is interesting to say the least. It makes you wonder, with the book taking place after the game, what ended up happening to Lydon after the events of the game? This of course is if she isn't lying about where she's from, or if time dilation took effect on her and she is from a Lydon years before Orion and June tried to make it better for humanity there. After this, him and Liliana go to a hotel before the mission and spend the night together, if you know what I mean. All of this, and that was just the first half of Chapter 2. There was a ton of information given here, and a lot of interesting things we learned about Celestials in the first half of this section in Chapter 2. We also learned that to be a part of a traveler group, you essentially have to do a ton of odd jobs, which reminds me of something like Cyberpunk 2077, where you had to build your rep to take better and better jobs to become a Night City legend. But in this case, it's for the chance to be a part of a traveler exodus. Overall, I was thrilled while reading this part of Chapter 2, and it started to get more and more intense once we got into Finn's first mission. And now we're getting into this build-up for what could be a really high-profile mission for Urana. So without further ado, let's get into the second half of Chapter 2. Getting back into it, we start back up with the Empress we were following along with before during the enthronement event happening for their new queen. She spotted a distinguished looking new life, or celestial who was about to start mindlining, called Count Beckett. Here she meets him after the ceremony, after the initial meeting between the Empresses ended. She finds him intriguing, essentially meaning she is probably interested in him for a relationship, or at the very least, for churning out another princess. After this segment, we turn back to Finn, who is about to start his mission. He describes his armor, all while running system checks all on his end. While doing this, he also describes most of the team members around him as well. In it, he describes a member with heavy armor and mounted guns on his shoulders, and a person in a sleek bodysuit that sounds like light armor. Both of these might be iterations of Aegis suits that we could see in the video game as well. If these are in fact Aegis suit variations, I'm pretty sure we'll see these in the Traveler's Handbook when that comes out in March or April. As they set off to go execute the mission, Finn describes the Cyberpunk 2077 feeling downtown scene as they embark out to the skyscraper where the mission is about to take place. During this journey to downtown, he says they sent out some drones the size of insects with encrypted comms to keep track of the family and make sure they are where they're supposed to be. I found this very interesting, and I wonder if it is also something we might see in the video game as well, at the very least in a story standpoint. After that, they introduced something from the Exodus universe which, to me anyways, sounds terrifying. Finn talks about not wanting to kill the family members, and instead wanting to use a U-Buster to erase their memories and essentially their entire personalities and lives. The U-Buster is described as a sort of stealth weapon that looks like a disc that has to be applied to the back of someone's head. And it has to be directly on it, you can't just put it over someone's helmet. So Finn came up with a plan to use the nerve jam to stun the family members, and then use the U-Buster to wipe the person's memories and traits. Essentially, using a U-Buster on a person erases their life experiences and reverts them back to knowing almost nothing, and being almost like a newly born person. So you're still alive technically, but you'll never be your true self again. It's essentially Alzheimer's the weapon. Once Finn and his team got in position, they started using something described as being derived by celestial tech called UPS. It allows them to manually, or have the construct intelligence of his suit automatically use this UPS in particular to climb and stick to any surface with their limbs. It sounds like it could be very useful when it comes to maybe ship repairs in space, and in situations like this where you need to climb big surfaces. Finally, Finn and his team bust onto the floor that they're supposed to meet at, and all 8 of his squad members make it. They start making their way to the nearest stairwell to make it to their objective, being the family, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, someone throws what they call sea foam grenades, which are described as fast-moving water or liquid that quickly solidifies like concrete and traps people in it. This sea foam encases Finn in his suit, and eventually after struggling he gets stuck in the thick sludge it turns into, that then solidifies even more and completely encases him. He starts to try and use his power blade to get out, but because of how he's encased, he can't get the blade out. He then starts to panic and gets super frustrated like anyone would in his situation. I know personally I would get very claustrophobic very quickly. Luckily enough, even though he was basically encased in cement, his suit was supplying air for him. It's mentioned that his suit system essentially works something like Jarvis does for Iron Man's suit. At least that's how I interpreted it. He was able to have full-on conversations with it and was able to ask it to do X or Y thing, and the suit would answer or comply with his commands if it was within the suit's limits. After getting worse in terms of his panic, the suit suggested it administer a sedative. But the problem was, he only had 90 minutes before the hot air that couldn't get expunged from his suit anymore after being encased would kill Finn from the temperatures being too high. So he didn't at first want to go ahead and take the sedative. Eventually, after panicking harder and seeing no way to actually get out himself, he decided to take half a dose of the sedative and play some music that he was into. He drifted into a drowsy state as he waited for his last hope of someone hopefully getting him out of this scenario from the outside. Overall, for this part, it was so interesting and intense. There was a lot going on, and I personally reread a lot of these parts because I was so confused on the action segments and where the grenades ended up coming from. Overall, it had me thinking of how Finn would get out of the situation, and made a great cliffhanger ending for it to switch perspectives and have us going back to following the Empress we had been with before. They set the scene up by having the Empress at the meeting table apparently, where they hold all of their important talks between all the Empresses. They made a point of mentioning that apparently the exiled and killed traitorous Queen Zuberi's skeleton is encased in this very table that they're meeting around. The middle of the table is hollowed out, and the skeleton, which is apparently missing a left leg since one of the Empresses blew it off while she was resisting, and then they slapped a U-buster on her head for good measure, essentially erasing her existence like we touched on before. Then another Empress put something which I believe was called down dust, a chemical weapon of sort, on Zuberi's head, which annihilated every molecular bond there, eating away large sections of her skull, leaving her jawbone wide open, looking like she was screaming even now. And all of this happened while the queens were laughing and rejoicing in doing this after they caught her as well. All of this was seemingly from the Empress that we are following's recollection of the events that happened when they took Zuberi down. She also mentioned that queens are enthroned for 60 years or until death, whichever happens to come first. And usually, a new queen would start with a brand new Mindline body. After all of this was explained, and we got that gruesome backstory of Zuberi's skeleton that was in their meeting table, we are finally in the official meeting between the Empresses. And they talk about a couple of important Crown Dominion topics, one being about the communique the Empress we are following just got. She didn't tell them about it, she wanted to keep it for herself, but they knew from other sources apparently anyways, and they discussed it in the meeting. But first, they brought up the topic of the Maruyama. As mentioned before, apparently the Maruyama are 5 light years away, and although some of the Empresses couldn't care less, the more cautious ones are wary of their intentions of even being this close to the Crown Dominion territory in the first place. And they even play out some scenarios of what could happen if the encounter happens to go wrong, even toying with the idea of what would happen if war ensued. Here it gets brought up that apparently the Maruyama don't play the political power struggle like the rest of the Celestials that they call the Great Game, but at the same time, they seem powerful enough to where their presence alone needs political mention. After the meeting, the Empress we follow wanted her father to invite the new blood Count Beckett to her court, assumingly to try and quote-unquote get to know them more, and maybe even make another princess. At least that's how I'm interpreting it. After this scene finished up, we jump back into Finn's shoes after getting awakened by things happening around him. He notices that 83 of the 90 minutes that he had before the heat got too built up in his suit were up. After a bit, he noticed that he heard a drill of some sort trying to cut through the steam foam that he was encased in. Once the drill got through, it ended up hitting his suit and ceasing the construct intelligence that was helping him in displaying all of his sensors, making the display look pitch black and upping the panic in him once more. After a while, they were able to get him out of the sea foam and pull his helmet off. At this moment, we now learn Liliana was a double agent all along. Apparently, she was hired by the family that was a target for the mission in order to stop missions or things like this from happening. She was also revealed to be the one that trapped everybody in sea foam and was drilling Finn out with the help of some of the target family's private security. This then ultimately leads us back to the events that happened in the beginning of the book, where he was dumped off somewhere remote because she says something along the lines of, since he is from a well-known family and well-off family, they might eventually want to know what happened to him, so instead of dumping him with the rest of the mercenaries captured, they dumped him off somewhere they thought he wouldn't make it out from, and remote enough so he would never be found. I'm assuming it's so that they never find out that this family did this to Finn, so that Finn's family never retaliates. Also, I felt I needed to point this out. She also said their quote-unquote time together in the hotel room was whatever, basically hurting his ego and making him feel pathetic. So at this point, I'm rooting for my boy Finn here to get all of the revenge possible, whenever he inevitably gets off the rock he was thrown on, but I guess we'll have to wait and see if that ends up happening. And with this, we finally wrap up Chapter 2. Oh my god, was this one long. But man, it had me gripped for most of it. The setup for the mission, learning a lot of things about the Celestials in this region, and also the situation Finn got in during both missions were really fun to read through. Overall, like I mentioned a bit during the review of this chapter, I do feel as though there are a couple of similarities in this game to something like Cyberpunk 2077. And by this game, I mean this franchise. I mean, it's got a book, it's got a tabletop RPG, and it's about to have a video game, right? There are a couple of other examples and short stories on the website as well that remind me of Cyberpunk 2. like the rival character from the Ilmet story having a sort of on-the-fly eye replacement, or how the weapon works in the Bequest short story as well, where the weapon assesses threats for you. It just in general seems like there are some cool elements from that franchise that could in one way or another show up to be used in Exodus as well. As a whole, Chapter 2 was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to being thrown back into the present time to see what happens to Finn now that he's semi-safe with the new people he found over on the planet he was thrown on by Liliana and her goons. That wraps up my thoughts and summary of the second chapter. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this chapter, if I missed out on anything important, and if you were as locked in as I was during the missions Finn went on as well. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more chapter by chapter videos just like this, along with coverage on everything Exodus, like theories, speculation, news updates, and a full-on podcast on the franchise as well. As always, your support through your viewership, liking, and subscribing is always greatly appreciated and helps me out tremendously against the celestial threat that is the YouTube algorithm. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to catch you guys next time. Peace!